think you know what heartbreak is? Try being stripped of your home, your family, and your very identity just because your bloodline didn't manifest the way they wanted. That's exactly what happened to 21-year-old Alara Thornwell, thrown into the freezing wilderness of the Cascade Mountains to die. She was deemed the weakest link of the Silver Pines pack. But fate has a wicked, unpredictable sense of humor, because the girl cast out for being utterly powerless was about to stumble upon a dying beast in the snow. A beast that just happened to be the most terrifying Alpha King in existence. The mahogany doors of the Silver Pines pack hall slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Alara Thornwell's bones. Outside, the December wind was howling through the Washington state pines, dropping the temperature well below freezing. But inside the council room, the air was suffocatingly hot. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the heavy metallic tang of shifting alpha pheromones. Alara stood dead center on the woven rug, her hands trembling so violently she had to dig her fingernails into her palms to stop them. She was 21 years old, an age by which every werewolf was supposed to have met. Their inner wolf shifted and taken their rightful place in the pack hierarchy. But Alara's inner landscape was brutally, agonizingly silent. Alara Thornwell. The voice of Alpha Magnus Ashford boomed from the head of the tribunal table. Magnus was a massive man with prematurely graying hair and a cruel, calculated stare. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her like a stain on his pristine marble floor. The pack doctor, Dr. Harrison, has submitted his final evaluation. 21 years of age, 0 fluctuations in your lycanthropic aura, 0 bone density shifts, 0 connection to the moon's pull, Doctor. Harrison, an older man who had delivered Alara when her mother was still alive, refused to meet her eyes. He simply stared at his clipboard, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. You are a human, Magnus spat the word like it was poison. Worse, you are a defective wolf draining the resources of the Silver Pines. We are a pack of warriors, Alara. We do not harbor the weak. Alpha, please. Alara's voice cracked. She hated how small she sounded. My parents died defending the northern borders for this pack. I work in the kitchens. I balance the pack's financial ledgers. I contribute. A harsh laugh cut through the room. It belonged to Sienna Nightbrook, Alara's former childhood friend, who had recently shifted into a stunning silver-furred beta and subsequently made Alara's life a living nightmare. Sienna leaned against a wooden pillar, crossing her arms. You do human math, Alara. Congratulations. Any human off the streets of Seattle could do that. You can't fight, you can't patrol, and if rogues attack, you're nothing but a liability. Silence, Magnus commanded, though a faint smirk played on his lips at Sienna's words. He stood up, towering over the room. The ambient pressure in the hall spiked the raw force of an alpha demanding submission. Alara, even without a wolf, felt her knees buckle under the sheer weight of his aura. The laws of our ancestors are clear, Magnus proclaimed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. A wolf who cannot shift by their 21st winter is declared void-born, a dead branch on the pack tree, and dead branches must be pruned so the rest of the tree can survive. Panic seized Alara's throat. Magnus Alpha, you can't. The blizzard warnings. I, Magnus Ashford Alpha of the Silver Pines, hereby sever the pack bond with Alara Thornwell. He roared, completely ignoring her plea. The physical pain was immediate and blinding. It felt as though a serrated blade had been shoved into Alara's chest, hooking around her heart and violently yanked out. The invisible comforting tether that connected her to the minds and souls of everyone in the room snapped. The sudden silence in her head was deafening. She gasped, falling to her hands and knees, clutching her chest as tears of pure agony spilled onto the rug. You are stripped of our name, our protection, and our territory, Magnus continued, stepping down from the dais to loom over her gasping form. You have 10 minutes to collect what fits in a single bag. Then you walk into the timberline. If any patrol catches your scent within our borders by sundown, you will be hunted as a rogue. Alara looked up through blurry eyes. The faces of the pack members, people she had known her entire life, people who had eaten the meals she cooked, were entirely blank. A cold, terrifying realization washed over her. They didn't care. To them, her weakness was a disease they were finally curing. 10 minutes later, Alara was shoved out the back doors of the pack house. She wore her thickest winter coat, a pair of worn hiking boots, and carried a canvas backpack containing a medical kit, a flashlight, a few protein bars, and a heavy wool blanket. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The snow was already knee-deep, and the sky was a bruised, darkening purple. She looked back once at the sprawling timber and stone mansion that had been her only home. Sienna was standing in the window watching her with a satisfied sneer. Swallowing the sob that threatened to choke her, Alara turned her back on the Silver Pines pack and began to walk. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face, stinging her cheeks. Without a wolf to regulate her body heat, the freezing temperatures were a death sentence. Magnus knew it. Sienna knew it. They hadn't just banished her. They had executed her. As she waded deeper into the old-growth forest of the Cascades, the silence of the woods pressed in on her. Her legs burned with exhaustion, the snow dragging at her boots like wet cement. Night fell rapidly, bringing with it a darkness so absolute it felt suffocating. By midnight, Ilara couldn't feel her toes or her fingers. Her core temperature was dropping dangerously low. "I am not going to die like this," she told herself, gritting her teeth. "I refuse to give them the satisfaction." Through the howling whiteout of the blizzard, her flashlight beam caught the jagged outline of a structure. It was an old, rotting logging cabin wedged between two massive cedar trees, long abandoned by humans and entirely off the pack's radar. It was her only chance. Pushing her freezing body to the absolute limit, Alara collapsed through the broken front door, the rotting wood splintering beneath her weight. It was dilapidated and smelled of mildew, but it was out of the wind. She crawled into the corner, wrapping herself tightly in the wool blanket, shivering so violently her teeth chipped against each other. She survived that first night. But as dawn broke, casting a pale gray light through the cracked windows, Ilara realized surviving the cold was only her first problem. She was in rogue territory now, and she was completely defenseless. 3 days passed. Ilara survived on half a protein bar a day and melted snow she gathered in a rusted tin can she found in the cabin's debris. The storm outside raged on a relentless barrage of ice and wind that kept her trapped in her small, freezing sanctuary. On the fourth morning, the wind finally died down. The silence that followed was heavy, almost ringing in her ears. Ilara knew she had to move. She needed dry wood to start a fire, and she desperately needed to find a way toward human civilization. The nearest human town was at least 30 miles away through brutal, mountainous terrain. But staying in the cabin meant slowly starving to death. She wrapped her scarf tightly over her nose and mouth and stepped out into the waist-deep snow. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the pine trees drooping under the weight of the ice. She hadn't gone 50 yards when she smelled it. It was sharp metallic and carried the distinct, unmistakable scent of burning ozone. Blood. And not just any blood. It was werewolf blood laced with silver. Silver acted like a toxic acid to lycanthropes, searing their flesh and stopping their supernatural healing factor dead in its tracks. Alara froze her breath, pluming in the frigid air. A smart person, a weak human-like girl banished from her pack, would turn around and run in the opposite direction. If a rogue wolf was bleeding out nearby, approaching, it was suicide. A wounded predator is the most dangerous kind. But Alara's eyes caught a trail of crimson splashed violently across the pristine white snow. The sheer volume of blood was staggering. Whatever was bleeding out wasn't just injured, it was dying. Against every survival instinct screaming in her brain, Alara followed the red trail. It wound through a thicket of blackberry brambles, the thorns torn and broken by something massive. She rounded a large snowdrift and stopped dead in her tracks, a gasp escaping her lips. Lying half buried in a crater of bloody snow was a wolf, but wolf felt like an entirely inadequate word. This creature was monstrous, easily the size of a grizzly bear. Its fur was midnight black, standing out in stark, terrifying contrast against the snow. Even lying motionless, it radiated a dangerous wild power that made Alara's knees tremble. It was breathing but barely. Its massive chest heaved in shallow, ragged jerks. Along its flank and shoulder, Alara saw the horrifying source of the blood. Deep, jagged puncture wounds wept dark, sluggish blood. The edges of the flesh burned black and bubbling, the undeniable signature of silver bullets. Alara took a tentative step backward. She should leave. She had to leave. This was a monster that could snap her in half with a single bite. Suddenly, the beast's head twitched. A pair of eyes snapped open, locking onto her. They weren't the standard yellow or amber of normal pack wolves. They were a piercing molten gold, ringed with an ancient, terrifying intensity. For a split second, Alara felt an electric shock arc through the air, raising the hairs on her arms. A strange phantom warmth bloomed in her painfully silent chest. The wolf growled a low rumbling sound that vibrated the snow around her boots, but the sound ended in a pathetic wet cough. Its golden eyes dimmed, rolling back into its head as the massive creature lost consciousness, its head thumping heavily back onto the ice. Alara stood frozen for a long minute. He's going to die, she thought. Whoever he is, whatever he's done, he's going to die right here. She thought of Magnus's cruel eyes. She thought of being left to freeze to death because she was deemed useless. The empathy that had always been her greatest flaw and her greatest secret strength flared to life. I am officially an idiot, Alara muttered to the empty forest. Dropping her backpack, she rushed to the wolf's side. Up close, the heat radiating off his body was immense, like an open oven door, though it was rapidly fading. The silver poisoning was spreading quickly through his veins. Okay, big guy, Alara whispered, pulling off her thick mittens with trembling fingers. I'm not going to hurt you. Please don't wake up and eat me. She unzipped her backpack and pulled out her medical kit. It wasn't much. Tweezer's gauze, a bottle of human-grade antiseptic and bandages, but she had assisted Dr. Harrison enough times to know how to dig out a bullet. The first wound was on his shoulder. Alara braced herself, plunging the tweezers into the torn, burned flesh. The wolf violently flinched, a low whine escaping his muzzle. I know. I'm sorry. She shushed him frantically, terrified he would wake. Her fingers dug deep, hitting something hard. With a sickening squelch, she pulled out a deformed silver hollow-point bullet. The moment the silver left his body, the burned edges of the wound hissed. A tiny fraction of his natural healing trying to kick in. Alara worked like a woman possessed. The cold was biting through her clothes, turning her fingers stiff and clumsy. But she didn't stop. She dug 2 more bullets out of his flank, gagging at the smell of burned blood and ozone. By the time she extracted the final piece of silver shrapnel, Alara was covered in his blood, panting heavily. But he was too big to leave in the snow. If the freezing temperatures didn't kill him, whoever shot him might come back to finish the job. With superhuman effort born of pure adrenaline, Alara grabbed the wolf by the scruff of his thick neck and his uninjured front leg. Come on, she grunted, planting her boots in the snow. Move. It took her nearly an hour to drag the massive beast the 50 yards back to the cabin. By the time she hauled him through the broken doorway, her muscles were screaming in agony, and she collapsed onto the dusty floor beside him, gasping for air. She dragged her wool blanket over him, trying to trap whatever body heat he had left. As the sun set, plunging the cabin back into freezing darkness, the wolf's breathing leveled out. Alara sat huddled next to him, her back against the rotting wall, shivering. She reached out tentatively, pressing her bare hand into the thick fur of his uninjured neck to check his pulse. The moment her skin touched him, a literal spark of static electricity snapped between them. Alara jerked her hand back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Before she could process what had just happened, a sickening crunch of bone echoed through the small cabin. The wolf was shifting. Alara scrambled backward, pressing herself flat against the wall as the massive beast contorted. Fur receded into skin. Bones snapped and realigned with terrifying speed. The heat in the room spiked. When the shifting stopped, a man lay unconscious on the floor in the place of the wolf. He was breathtakingly rugged, tall, heavily muscled, and covered in a map of intricate, silver-scarred runic tattoos across his chest and arms, markings Alara had only ever read about in forbidden pack history books, marks that belonged to royal bloodlines. His dark hair was matted with sweat and snow, and his strong jaw was shadowed with stubble. He shifted weakly, groaning in pain. His golden eyes fluttered open, delirious and unfocused. He looked blindly toward the ceiling, his chest heaving. Chamomile! He rasped, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that sent a bizarre shiver straight down Alara's spine. Chamomile and cedarwood. He was smelling her. The man rolled his head, his golden eyes finally finding Alara cowering in the shadows. For a fraction of a second, the delirium cleared. The sheer, overwhelming possessiveness that flared in his gaze made Alara stop breathing. Mine, he whispered fiercely. Right before his eyes rolled back and he passed out cold on the floor. Alara sat in the freezing darkness, staring at the naked, heavily tattooed, impossibly dangerous stranger she had just saved. Mine, she repeated aloud the word, feeling heavy and dangerous in the quiet air. Alara Thornwell, the girl without a wolf, the girl banished for being broken, had just triggered a mate bond. And she had absolutely no idea that the man bleeding on her floor wasn't just a rogue. Freezing to death was a deceptive creeping process. Alara knew this from the countless lonely hours she had spent sequestered in the Silver Pines Pack library, devouring survival journals. She had been particularly obsessed with accounts of the indigenous hunters in Oymyakon, Siberia, a place infamous for being the coldest inhabited region on Earth. The text detailed how they survived at temperatures that could shatter steel not just with fire, but with strategic insulation and the preservation of core body heat. Right now, Alara had no fire, but she had a rotting cabin, a single wool blanket, and an unconscious, heavily muscled man who was currently burning through his supernatural reserves just to keep his heart beating. He was shivering violently, the intricate runic tattoos on his chest contracting with every ragged breath. The silver poisoning was mostly gone thanks to her crude surgery, but the blood loss and the extreme drop in temperature were pushing his lycanthropic healing factor past its breaking point. I can't believe I'm doing this, Alara muttered, her breath pluming in the dark, frigid air. Using the principles she'd read about regarding Siberian survival, she first scraped up handfuls of snow from the broken doorway, packing it tightly into the gaping cracks in the cabin walls. Counterintuitively, the dense snow acted as a windbreak and a powerful insulator, trapping the ambient air inside. Next, she dragged a pile of dry pine boughs she had found in the corner, creating a makeshift mattress to lift him off the freezing, heat-leaching floorboards. But it wasn't enough. His skin was turning an ashen gray. Swallowing her pride and her terror, Alara unzipped her heavy winter coat. She crawled beneath the scratchy wool blanket, pressing her smaller, trembling body flush against his massive, icy chest. The moment her skin made contact with his, that terrifying electric spark snapped between them again, sending a jolt straight to the base of her skull. He felt like a slab of frozen marble. Alara wrapped her arms around his torso, burying her face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of pine ozone and dark, rich earth. She willed her own body heat into him, praying it would be enough to jumpstart his system. Hours bled into a numb, shivering blur. The wind outside howled, rattling the rotting timbers of the cabin. But inside their tiny, insulated cocoon, a slow, steady warmth began to build. The dangerous pallor of his skin slowly faded, replaced by the faint flush of returning blood flow. His breathing deepened, matching the rhythm of Alara's own hammering heart. Just as the first slivers of dawn began to bleed through the frosted window panes, a deep, earth-shattering growl vibrated against Alara's chest. She froze. The man's golden eyes snapped open. They were no longer unfocused or delirious. They were razor-sharp, lethal, and burning with an intensity that pinned Alara completely in place. His massive hands shot out with terrifying speed, wrapping around her waist and instantly rolling them over so he was hovering above her, pinning her to the pine boughs. "Who are you?" His voice was a lethal rasp, vibrating with the raw, suppressed power of a supreme alpha. Alara's heart slammed against her ribs. She shoved her hands against his chest, her palms pressing against the hard ridges of his scars. "Get off me! I'm the person who just spent the last 10 hours digging silver hollow points out of your flank so you wouldn't die in the snow." The man blinked, the sheer aggression in his posture faltering for a fraction of a second. He glanced down at his shoulder, noticing the crude, bloody bandages for the first time. Then he looked back at Alara. His nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, taking in her scent. The golden ring around his irises expanded, swallowing the dark of his pupils. "Chamomile and cedarwood," he murmured, the deadly edge in his voice melting into something far more dangerous. "Raw, undeniable possession. You are my mate." Alara shoved him harder, managing to wriggle out from beneath his heavy frame. She scrambled backward until her back hit the cabin wall, pulling her coat tightly around herself. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have a wolf. I'm void-born." The man slowly sat up, the wool blanket falling to his waist. He didn't seem to care that the air was hovering below zero. He tilted his head, studying her with a predator's meticulous calculation. Void-born, a werewolf without a spirit. Rare, usually a genetic anomaly. He took another breath, tasting the air. "You carry the lingering scent of the Silver Pines pack. Yet you are out here alone in a blizzard devoid of pack protection." Alara lifted her chin, refusing to let him see the sting of rejection that still burned in her chest. "Alpha Magnus banished me. He decided a wolf who couldn't shift by 21 was a drain on resources. I was cast out to die." A low, terrifying rumble started in the back of the man's throat. It wasn't directed at her. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated violence directed at the name she had just spoken. The shadows in the cabin seemed to deepen, bending toward him. Magnus Ashford is a fool who rules a pack of cowards, the man stated coldly, his muscles tensing. He threw away his own bloodline for an ancient, outdated prejudice, and in doing so he threw away the mate of the Alpha King. Alara's breath hitched. Her blood ran ice cold, her mind violently rewinding the last 24 hours. Alpha King, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're Kale Ravenshade. The stories of the Western King were legendary, whispered by the fireside to terrify unruly pups. He was a conqueror, a ruthlessly efficient leader who had united the fractured Western territories through sheer force of will and spilled blood. I am, Kale confirmed, his golden eyes locking onto hers. And you little voidborn just saved my life a debt I intend to repay by putting a crown on your head. Before Alara could even begin to process the sheer absurdity of his claim, Kale's head snapped toward the door. The possessive warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating stare of a killer. Get behind me, he ordered, his voice dropping to a near silent whisper. What? Alara asked, confused. We are no longer alone. The absolute silence of the forest was suddenly broken by the sharp, distinct crunch of heavy boots breaking through the icy crust of the snow. Alara scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. She instinctively grabbed the heavy, rusted iron fireplace poker she had found in the debris the day before. It was a pathetic weapon against fully grown werewolves, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Kale stood up completely unbothered by his lack of clothing, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that belied the fact he had been bleeding out just hours ago. He pressed his back against the wall next to the broken doorway, motioning for Alara to stay hidden in the darkest corner of the cabin. Two of them, Kale whispered, his chest barely moving as he breathed. Mercenaries, the same filth who ambushed me at the border. Why are they hunting you? Alara whispered back, her knuckles turning white around the iron poker. Because a king's head fetches a high price on the black market, Kale replied grimly. And a king traveling alone without his royal guard is an opportunity they couldn't resist. Outside, a voice rang out, harsh and mocking. Come on out, your majesty. We tracked your blood trail right to this pathetic little shack. We know you're in there, and we know you're pumped full of enough silver to drop a bull elephant. That would be Caleb, Kale murmured to Alara, his lips curving into a deadly anticipatory smile, loud, arrogant, and slow on his left side. Don't make us burn this rotting timber to the ground, Ravenshade, a second voice yelled. Come out and take it like a man. Kale closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Alara watched in awe as the muscles across his back rippled and shifted. His bones popped loudly, reshaping with sickening speed. He wasn't fully shifting into his massive black wolf that would tear apart the small cabin, but he was calling on his lycanthropic strength, partially transforming. His fingernails elongated into jagged, lethal claws, and his canine teeth lengthened into terrifying fangs. Stay here, Kale commanded. Do not make a sound. Before Alara could argue, Kale exploded through the broken doorway. The sound of the impact was like a freight train hitting a brick wall. Alara flinched as screams tore through the freezing morning air. She crept toward the window, wiping away the grime, to peer outside. In the blinding white snow, absolute carnage was unfolding. Kale was a blur of violence. Even wounded and weakened, the Alpha King was a force of nature. He had tackled the larger of the two mercenaries, Caleb, pinning him to the trunk of a massive cedar tree. With a sickening crunch, Kale's claws tore through Caleb's thick winter gear, finding the soft flesh beneath. But the second mercenary, a wiry man with a brutal scar across his nose, raised a customized, heavy-duty hunting rifle aiming it squarely at Kale's back. Hey, King, the sniper yelled. Kale turned, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Alara saw the silver glint of the specialized ammunition in the chamber. If Kale took another silver bullet to his core while his healing factor was already depleted, he would die. And if he died, Alara was next. Survival instinct honed by years of being treated as prey by her own pack kicked in. Alara didn't think. She kicked open the shattered remnants of the cabin door, lunging out into the knee-deep snow. She gripped the heavy iron poker with both hands, let out a scream of pure desperate adrenaline, and swung it like a baseball bat directly at the sniper's knees. The solid iron connected with a sickening crack. The mercenary howled in agony, his leg buckling sideways. The rifle fired wildly into the canopy, missing Kale by inches and showering them in a spray of pine needles and snow. Kale didn't waste the opening. In a single fluid motion, he dropped Caleb's limp body and lunged at the sniper, his massive hand clamping down around the man's throat, lifting him entirely off his feet. The sniper choked, his eyes bulging as he clawed helplessly at Kale's iron grip. "Who hired you?" Kale roared, his voice echoing off the mountains laced with so much alpha command that even Alara without a wolf felt her knees threaten to give out. I, I don't, the mercenary gasped. Kale's grip tightened, his claws drawing blood. "Give me a name or I will tear your throat out and let your friend bleed to death in the snow." "Red Moon, the Red Moon Pack." The man choked out, his face turning purple. "They paid us, told us your route." Kale's eyes flashed with a lethal, terrifying gold. He dropped the mercenary into the snow, standing over him like an avenging god. "Tell the Red Moon Alpha that Kale Ravenshade is still breathing. And tell him I am coming for his head." He turned away, leaving the two broken mercenaries groaning in the blood-stained snow. Kale walked back toward Alara, the terrifying aura of the Alpha King receding slightly as his eyes locked onto hers. He looked at the iron poker still clutched in her trembling hands, then up at her face, pale but fiercely determined. "For a human with no wolf," Kale said, a genuine dark amusement dancing in his eyes, "you swing a very heavy piece of iron, Alara." Alara dropped the poker, her adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her shivering violently in the biting cold. "You knew my name." "I know everything about my mate," Kale said softly, stepping close enough that she could feel the immense heat radiating off his body again. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers gently brushing a strand of dark hair out of her eyes. "We need to move. They will send more. And my territory is 3 days' travel through these mountains." Alara looked at the brutal wilderness stretching out before them. "I can't survive 3 days out there. I'm too slow. I'll hold you back." Kale suddenly bent down, sweeping Alara entirely off her feet and into his massive arms. She gasped, grabbing his broad shoulders to steady herself. "You didn't hold me back today, little Voidborn," Kale whispered, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending another jolt of that terrifying electric bond through her veins. And a king never leaves his queen behind. With Alara securely in his arms, Kale turned his back on the ruined cabin and stepped into the untamed wilderness, leaving the territory of the pack that had discarded her far behind. The ascent toward the jagged peaks of Mount Shuksan was a grueling test of endurance that no ordinary human could have survived. Kyle did not let Alara walk. He knew the heavy wet snow and the rapidly dropping temperatures of the higher altitudes would sap her remaining strength within hours. Instead, once they were a safe distance from the ruined cabin, he set her down just long enough to shift. The transformation was violent and breathtaking. Where a massive, heavily tattooed man had stood, a monstrous midnight black wolf now crouched in the snow. He was the size of a draft horse, his thick fur absorbing the pale winter sunlight, his golden eyes fixed on her with absolute intelligence. He nudged her legs with his massive snout, lowering his front shoulders. "You want me to ride?" Alara asked, her voice trembling slightly. The great wolf let out a soft, affirmative chuff, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Alara carefully swung her leg over his broad back, burying her freezing, mitten-clad hands deep into the thick scruff of his neck. The moment she was settled, Kale surged forward. His pace was relentless, his massive paws acting like snowshoes as he bounded up the treacherous inclines. Alara pressed her face against his neck, shielded from the biting wind by the sheer mass of his body. The heat radiating from him was a lifeline. As the hours blurred together and the temperature plummeted toward zero, Alara kept her mind sharp by reciting passages from the survival journals she had practically memorized in the Silver Pines library. She thought of the indigenous hunters in Omayakon, Yakutia, the coldest permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. They survived by understanding the microclimates of the taiga, knowing that moving water meant slightly warmer air and that dense pine clusters blocked the deadly wind chill. She guided Kale with gentle tugs on his fur, steering him away from the exposed ridges and into the dense old-growth timber where the wind couldn't slice through her heavy coat. Kale, despite his primal instincts and superior senses, yielded to her direction without hesitation. The Alpha King, a creature of pure dominance, was letting a void-born human guide his path. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement of the Bandian tethering their souls together. By nightfall, they reached a network of shallow limestone caves carved into the side of the mountain. Kale carried her inside out of the howling wind before shifting back into his human form. The exertion had taken its toll, The silver poisoning from the day before combined with the massive caloric burn of carrying her for miles left his skin pale and his breathing ragged. "You need food," Alara said, her voice echoing softly in the dark cave. She fumbled with her backpack, pulling out her last 3 protein bars and shoving them into his hands. "Eat. Your metabolism is burning through your reserves." Kale looked at the cheap foil-wrapped bars, then up at her. He was entirely naked, yet completely unbothered by the freezing air, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. He ate the food in 3 quick bites, though it was a pathetic substitute for the raw meat a lycanthrope truly needed to heal. "We cross the ridge tomorrow," Kale rumbled, pulling Alara against his side so she could absorb his body heat. He wrapped her heavy wool blanket around them both. "Once we reach the eastern slopes, we enter neutral territory. My border patrols will find us there." Alara rested her head against his scarred chest, listening to the steady, powerful thud of his heart. "Why didn't you reject me?" She whispered the question that had been clawing at her throat, finally slipping free. "I'm broken," she continued. "A wolf who can't shift is a dead branch. I can't fight for you. I can't give you strong pups. An AlphaKing is supposed to have a Luna who commands the pack, not a human who needs to be carried through the snow." Kale's arm tightened around her waist like a vice. His hand reached up his rough, calloused fingers, tilting her chin, so she was forced to look into his eyes. The sheer intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. "Magnus is a fool obsessed with archaic biology." Kale said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "A mate is not a breeding mare, Alara. The moon goddess does not make mistakes. My soul is stained with the blood of 100 battles. I am violence incarnate. If I were paired with a female as dominant and bloodthirsty as I am, we would burn my kingdom to the ground. I do not need another warrior. I need an anchor." He pressed his forehead against hers, the electric hum of their bond flaring to life, warm and intoxicating. "You did not break in that cabin, Alara," Kale continued softly. "You dug silver out of a monster's flesh without flinching. You took an iron bar to a mercenary to protect a man you barely knew. You have more courage in your human bones than half the alpha males in my council. You are exactly what I need, and anyone who calls you broken will lose their tongue." Alara's eyes burned with unshed tears. For 21 years, she had been treated as a burden, a tragic mistake to be pitied or mocked. Here in the freezing dark of a mountain cave, the most dangerous man on the continent was looking at her like she was his salvation. "Sleep, my queen," Kale murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Tomorrow we take back our lives." But as Alara closed her eyes, exhausted to her very marrow, a deep, unsettling dread coiled in her stomach. The mountain outside was too quiet, and she knew with the cynical certainty of a girl who had been hunted by her own kind that the worst was yet to come. Morning broke with a deceptive, glittering brilliance. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, making the snow-capped peaks of the Cascades look like scattered diamonds. But the air was bitterly cold, snapping at Alara's lungs with every breath. Kale remained in his human form for the morning, needing to conserve the massive energy required for a shift. He broke the trail through the waist-deep drifts, pulling Alara along behind him by the hand. They were less than a mile from the eastern descent, the gateway to the neutral territories, when Kale suddenly stopped dead. The grip on Alara's hand tightened so violently she gasped. Kale's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the icy wind. The relaxed, confident posture of the king vanished, replaced instantly by the coiled, lethal tension of an apex predator cornered. "Behind me," Kale hissed, shoving Alara toward a massive snow-covered boulder. "Do not move. Do not breathe loudly." "What is it?" Alara whispered, panic spiking her adrenaline. "Silver?" Kale growled, his golden eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. "And wolfsbane. A lot of it." Before Alara could process his words, the tree line erupted. They didn't howl or announce themselves like honorable warriors. They moved with the silent, deadly precision of assassins. 12 massive wolves burst from the frosted pines, their fur a mix of mottled browns and grays. But they weren't alone. Behind them stepped 4 humans clad in heavy tactical winter gear, carrying rifles outfitted with high-tech scopes. They were entirely surrounded. From the center of the wolf pack, a colossal timber wolf with a coat the color of dried blood stepped forward. Its bones cracked and reformed in a rapid, sickening display of lycanthropic power, shifting into a tall, broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jaw. "Alpha Wyatt," Kale spat the name like a curse, standing tall, and placing himself entirely between Alara and the hunting party. I should have known the Red Moon Pack was too cowardly to fight me on my own soil. Wyatt smirked, pulling a heavy silver-plated hunting knife from his belt. Why fight you on your soil, King Kale, when we can trap you in the ice? You're weak. The mercenaries wounded you, and carrying that useless baggage, he pointed the tip of his blade toward Alara hidden behind the boulder, has drained you. You are trespassing on neutral ground, Wyatt, Kale warned, his voice vibrating with a terrifying ancient power that made the surrounding snow physically tremble. Walk away now, and I will only slaughter half your pack. Wyatt laughed, a harsh barking sound. You're not in a position to negotiate, Kyle, but I must admit I have to give credit where credit is due. We never would have found you if it weren't for a little insider information. Wyatt snapped his fingers. One of the tactical mercenaries stepped forward, pulling down his thick winter balaclava. Alara's heart stopped. The breath vanished from her lungs, replaced by a cold, sickening horror that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was Rowan Blackthorn, the second in command of the Silver Pines pack. Magnus's right-hand man. Rowan, Alara whispered, stumbling out from behind the boulder in sheer disbelief. What? What are you doing here? Rowan sneered at her, his eyes filled with the same disgust he had always shown her. Hello, Alara. Surviving longer than expected, I see. Magnus sends his regards. I don't understand, Alara stammered, looking between the Red Moon Alpha and her former packmate. It's simple politics, little Voidborn, Wyatt mocked. Your Alpha Magnus wants to expand the Silver Pines territory into the fertile valleys to the south. But King Kale here refused to grant him the land. So Magnus reached out to me. He knew my mercenaries failed to kill Kale at the border. But Magnus also knew something else. Wyatt's eyes gleamed with malicious triumph. Magnus knew that the great AlphaKing had a fatal weakness, an obsession with finding his fated mate. When our seers whispered that Kale's mate was a Voidborn in the Silver Pines pack, Magnus saw his opportunity. The pieces clicked together in Alara's mind, forming a picture so horrific she felt physically ill. Magnus didn't banish me because I was weak. Alara realized, her voice trembling with absolute fury. He banished me to act as bait. Exactly, Rowan chimed in, stepping forward with his silver-loaded rifle. We threw you out into the worst blizzard of the decade, knowing Kyle's patrols would be blinded. We knew his instincts would drag him toward your dying scent. You are nothing but a blood trail, Alara. A worm on a hook to draw the king out of his fortress. Kale let out a roar so deafening it cracked the ice on the nearby branches. His body began to expand, his muscles tearing through his human skin as he prepared to force a shift despite his drained energy. I will mount Magnus's head on a spike, and yours will sit right beside it, Wyatt. Take him down, Wyatt ordered. Use the nets. The tactical mercenaries fired, but they didn't shoot bullets. Heavy-weighted nets constructed of braided steel and pure concentrated silver wire exploded from the barrels of their modified weapons. Kale lunged his claws, extending, tearing through the throat of the first Red Moon wolf that jumped at him, but he was vastly outnumbered and exhausted. Two of the silver nets slammed into his massive body, tangling around his limbs. The moment the silver made contact with his skin, it began to burn. The hiss of searing flesh filled the air, accompanied by Kyle's agonized, earth-shattering roar. He crashed into the snow, thrashing violently. But the more he fought, the tighter the silver wire cut into his muscles, paralyzing him. The Red Moon wolves instantly swarmed him, snapping their jaw, pinning the struggling AlphaKing to the ground. No, Alara screamed, sprinting out from her cover. Rowan intercepted her, backhanding her across the face with brutal force. Alara hit the frozen ground hard, tasting copper as her lips split open. Stay down, human, Rowan spat, racking the bolt of his rifle and aiming it directly at Kale's head. You served your purpose. Wyatt walked slowly toward the immobilized king, his silver knife gleaming in the sunlight. Any last words, Your Majesty? Perhaps an apology for not sharing your southern valleys. Kale couldn't speak. His jaw was locked in agony as the silver burned through his nervous system, but his golden eyes bypassed Wyatt entirely. He looked straight at Alara, bleeding in the snow. Even in his dying moments, his gaze was filled with a fierce, protective love that shattered her heart. He is going to die, Alara thought, a wave of profound, suffocating despair washing over her. Because of me, because I was weak. But as she lay there in the snow, watching Rowan take aim at her mate's skull, something inside Alara's mind snapped. For 21 years, she had been told her inner landscape was silent. She had been told she was a void, an empty vessel devoid of lycanthropic power. But as her mate's life force began to flicker and fade, the silence in her head didn't just end. It violently imploded. It wasn't a wolf that woke up inside Alara Thornwell. It was something entirely different. Something ancient, terrifying, and deeply rooted in the very earth she bled upon. The air pressure in the clearing dropped so rapidly that Rowan's ears popped. The wind died completely, leaving an unnatural, suffocating vacuum. "What the hell is that?" one of the mercenaries muttered, lowering his weapon as the snow beneath their boots began to vibrate. Ilara pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her blood dripped onto the pristine white snow, but it didn't freeze. It sizzled. She looked up at Rowan, and the arrogant smirk vanished from the beta's face. Ilara's eyes were no longer their normal soft hazel. They were pitch endless, black, devoid of iris or pupil, swirling with a dark atmospheric energy. "You said I was a dead branch," Ilara's voice echoed, but it didn't sound like her own. It was a chorus of whispers sounding like shifting tectonic plates and grinding ice. "But you forgot, Rowan. Even dead branches can start a forest fire." The snow beneath Ilara's bleeding palms didn't just melt. It evaporated instantly into a thick, swirling mist. Rowan stumbled backward, his tactical boots slipping on the sudden sheet of solid ice forming in a massive radius around Ilara's kneeling form. The heavy rifle in his hands trembled. He had spent his entire life dominating the weak, but the suffocating atmospheric pressure radiating from the girl he had cast out was something primal. It bypassed werewolf biology entirely and struck straight at his survival instincts. "Shoot her!" Wyatt roared, fighting to keep his footing as the temperature plummeted so violently that the ambient moisture in the air began to crystallize into jagged shards. The three remaining mercenaries raised their weapons, their fingers clumsy and stiff from the sudden unnatural freeze. But before a single trigger could be pulled, Ilara lifted her head, her eyes swirling with an endless abyssal black, locked onto the men who were murdering her mate. The survival text she had obsessively read in the Silver Pines library about the brutal, merciless winters of Siberia hadn't just been a desperate coping mechanism. They had been a subconscious calling to her true dormant heritage. She was never meant to hold a wolf spirit. Her bloodline traced back to something far older, an ancient lineage of elemental frost weavers who had once lived symbiotically with the first packs, protecting them from the lethal grasp of winter. The power had been buried for generations, suppressed by modern pack breeding, waiting for a catalyst powerful enough to shatter the genetic dam. A mate bond with the AlphaKing, combined with the absolute threat of his death, was the ultimate catalyst. Ilara slammed her bare hands flat against the frozen earth. "Enough," she whispered. The word carried the weight of an avalanche. A shockwave of absolute zero erupted from her palms. It moved faster than a bullet. The silver nets pinning Kale to the ground froze completely solid in a fraction of a second. The metal became so intensely cold and brittle that it violently shattered into a million harmless, glittering fragments. The shockwave didn't stop there. It slammed into the mercenaries. The high-tech winter gear was useless against supernatural cold. The men gasped, their weapons dropping from paralyzed fingers as they collapsed into the snow, instantly locked in a state of suspended cryogenic shock. Alpha Wyatt stared in absolute horror. He shifted back into his massive blood-red wolf form, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But as he turned to run, a wall of razor-sharp ice spikes erupted from the ground, entirely blocking his path. Rowan was the only one left standing, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He looked at Ilara, his former packmate, the girl he had mocked and left to die. She stood up slowly, the wind whipping her dark hair around her pale, beautiful face. The snow seemed to bend to her will, swirling around her like a protective cloak. "You called me a dead branch, Rowan," Ilara said, her voice echoing with the crushing resonance of a glacier. "But I am the winter that prunes the rot." She raised a single finger. A localized blizzard instantly engulfed the beta, freezing the moisture in his lungs just enough to drop him to his knees, gasping for air he couldn't process. A deep, earth-shaking roar tore through the clearing. Free from the agonizing burn of the silver nets, Kale surged to his feet. His wounds were still severe, but the sheer blinding fury of the AlphaKing eclipsed his physical pain. He didn't even bother to shift into his wolf form. In a blur of devastating speed, Kyle crossed the distance to where Alpha Wyatt was trapped against the ice wall. Kale grabbed the massive red wolf by the throat, lifting the 500-pound beast entirely off the ground with one hand. His golden eyes blazed with lethal, unrestrained dominance. "You crossed my borders! You touched my mate!" Kale growled, his claws sinking deep into Wyatt's thick fur. The red moon pack falls today. With a sickening crunch that echoed off the mountain peaks, Kale snapped the alpha's neck. He tossed the lifeless body into the snow. An undisputed king executing an invader. The remaining Red Moon wolves, witnessing the death of their alpha and utterly terrified by the elemental display of the supposed Voidborn, dropped to their bellies, whimpering and exposing their throats in absolute submission to KL. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the howling wind that Alara now commanded. Kael turned slowly, his chest heaving, his body covered in blood and silver burns. He looked at the frozen mercenaries, at the cowering wolves, and finally at the woman standing in the center of the storm. Alara's eyes slowly faded from pitch black back to their warm, familiar hazel. The adrenaline crashed, and the immense magical exertion hit her frail human body all at once. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the ice, Kale was there. He caught her in his massive arms, pulling her tightly against his warm, heavily scarred chest. The electric spark of their bond flared brighter than ever, sealing the tether between the ancient Winter Queen and her warrior king. "I've got you," Kale murmured, fiercely burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of chamomile cedarwood and newly fallen snow. "I've got you, my queen." Alara clung to him, tears of exhaustion and profound relief freezing on her cheeks. "Magnus," she whispered, "he set this up. He tried to kill you to get to your lands." Kale looked over Alara's shoulder to where Rowan was still kneeling in the snow, shivering violently, trapped in Alara's frost. A dark, terrifying smile curved the Alpha King's lips. "Rowan is going to deliver a message for us," Kale said, his voice carrying the promise of absolute war. "He is going to walk back to the Silver Pines, and he is going to tell Magnus Ashford that Kale Ravenshade is coming not for land, not for resources." Kale cupped Alara's face, kissing her forehead with a reverence that defied his brutal nature. "We are coming to burn his throne to the ground." Alara rested her head against his racing heart, looking out over the treacherous snow-covered mountains. She was no longer a banished outcast, freezing to death alone in the dark. She was the mate of the most powerful alpha in existence, and she held the winner in the palm of her hand. The Silver Pines pack had thrown her to the wolves, completely unaware that she would return leading the entire pack. Kale released Rowan from the localized frost, allowing the beta to gasp and stumble to his feet. The terror in Rowan's eyes was absolute. He had seen what Alara could do. He had witnessed the birth of something no one in the Silver Pines had anticipated. "Run," Kale commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. "Run back to Magnus and tell him exactly what you saw here. Tell him the Voidborn he cast out has awakened. Tell him she commands winter itself. Tell him we are coming." Rowan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and fled, stumbling through the snow, his movements jerky with fear and lingering hypothermia. As his figure disappeared into the tree line, Kael looked down at Alara, still cradled in his arms. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. Alara nodded, though her legs felt like water. Kael set her down carefully, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her. "What happened to me?" Alara whispered, looking at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "I felt something inside me break open. It was like a dam shattering. I heard voices, ancient and cold, telling me to protect what was mine." "You are Frost Weaver," Kael said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. "An elemental bloodline that predates the modern wolf packs by centuries. Your ancestors were the guardians of winter, protectors who walked beside the first alphas and kept the packs alive through the harshest seasons." "But why now?" Alara asked. "Why didn't it manifest before?" "The Frost Weaver gift requires two things to awaken," Kale explained. "A moment of absolute necessity and a connection powerful enough to anchor the magic. Our mate bond provided the anchor. The threat to my life provided the necessity." He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face. "You are not broken, Alara. You never were. You are exactly what the moon goddess intended you to be." And Magnus, in his arrogance and ignorance, threw away the most powerful asset his pack could have had. Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of pain or rejection. They were tears of finally understanding her place in the world. "What happens now?" she asked. Kale's expression hardened, the warmth in his eyes shifting to cold determination. Now we finish the journey to my territory. We gather my forces, and then we march on Silver Pines. Magnus will answer for his crimes, Rowan will answer for his betrayal, and you will take your rightful place as Luna Queen of the Western Territories." He leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and possessive, a promise sealed in blood and ice. When he pulled back, his golden eyes burned with intensity. The girl they left to freeze has become winter itself, and winter is coming for Magnus Ashford. The descent down the eastern slopes was swift. KL shifted back into his massive black wolf, and Alara rode on his back, her confidence growing with each mile. She could feel the cold responding to her, now no longer an enemy to be endured, but a force she could command. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, the landscape changed. The wild, untamed forest gave way to managed timberlands. Boundary markers carved with runic symbols appeared on the trees. They had entered Kael's territory. Within an hour, a patrol of 6 wolves appeared surrounding them. But when they scented their king, they immediately shifted to human form, dropping to one knee in respect. "Your Majesty," the lead scout said, a muscular man with a shaved head and tribal tattoos. "We received word of an attack at the border. We've been searching for you for 2 days." "The attack was orchestrated by the Red Moon Pack and the Silver Pines," Kale said, shifting back to human form. One of the scouts immediately offered him clothing. "This is Alara Thornwell, my fated mate, and your future Luna Queen." The scouts' eyes widened, but they immediately bowed to Alara. "My queen," they said in unison. Alara felt a surge of emotion. Respect, acceptance, things she had never received from her own pack. "How far to Blackwood Citadel?" Kale asked. 3 hours at a run, Your Majesty," the lead scout replied. "Then we run," Kale said, "and send word ahead. I want the War Council assembled by dawn. We march on Silver Pines within the week." The scouts exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of what was coming. War. The journey to Blackwood Citadel was a blur of movement and growing anticipation. As they crested the final ridge, Alara saw it spread out in the valley below. It was magnificent, a massive fortress carved into the mountainside itself with towers of stone and timber rising toward the sky. Hundreds of buildings clustered around the central keep, smoke rising from chimneys. Even from this distance, Alara could see the movement of wolves and humans, a thriving community of over 2,000 souls. This was Kael's kingdom, and soon it would be hers as well. As they descended into the valley, wolves began to howl, a chorus of voices rising to greet their king's return. The sound was primal and beautiful, echoing off the mountains. Kael shifted one final time, and Alara slid from his back. He pulled her close as he transformed back to human form, accepting a heavy fur cloak from an attendant. "Welcome home, my queen," he whispered in her ear. And for the first time in her life, Alara truly felt like she was home. As they passed through the citadel gates, an elderly woman stood waiting in the courtyard, her eyes fixed on Alara with an expression of wonder and recognition. She wore the simple robes of a healer, but there was something ancient in her gaze. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing to Kale. Then she looked at Alara, and tears filled her eyes. "I felt the awakening from 100 miles away. I am Moira, the last frost weaver, or I was until you." Alara stared at the woman, feeling an inexplicable pull, as if some part of her soul recognized a kindred spirit. "We have much to discuss, child," Moira said gently, "and very little time to prepare you for what comes next." The gates of Blackwood Citadel closed behind them, and Kael Ravenshade, AlphaKing of the Western Territories, walked through the courtyard with his Frostweaver queen at his side. The war for justice was about to begin, and Magnus Ashford had no idea that the girl he left out in the cold was coming back to bring the storm directly to his doorstep. The Great Hall of Blackwood Citadel was a cathedral of timber and stone, its vaulted ceiling carved with the history of the Western Territories in intricate relief. Torches blazed in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the assembled war council. 8 wolves sat around the massive oak table, each one a leader of their respective regions within Kael's domain. They had answered their king's summons, arriving throughout the night, and now as dawn broke over the mountains, they waited to hear why they had been called. Kael stood at the head of the table, dressed in black leather and steel, every inch the warrior king. And beside him, wearing a gown of deep blue trimmed with white fur, stood Alara. The council members had heard whispers. The king's mate, a void born from Silver Pines, a woman who commanded winter itself. Now they would see if the whispers were true. Brothers and sisters, Kale began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. 2 days ago, I was ambushed on neutral ground by mercenaries hired by the Red Moon Pack. The attack was coordinated with Alpha Magnus Ashford of Silver Pines, who seeks to expand his territory into our southern valleys. Murmurs rippled through the council. Magnus used my fated mate as bait. Kale continued, his voice hardening. He banished her into a blizzard, knowing my instincts would draw me to her. He orchestrated my death for political gain. A female beta with silver-streaked hair slammed her fist on the table. This is an act of war. It is, Kale agreed, and we will answer it as such. But there is more you need to understand. He turned to Alara, extending his hand. She took it, stepping forward. Show them, Kale said softly. Alara's heart hammered in her chest. She had practiced this moment with Kyle throughout the previous evening, learning to control the power that had erupted so violently on the mountain. She closed her eyes, reaching for that cold, ancient presence inside her. It responded immediately, rising like a tide. When she opened her eyes, they were pitch black. The temperature in the great hall dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Frost began to crawl across the stone floor, spiraling outward from where Alara stood. The torches flickered, their flames turning blue at the edges. She raised her hand and the moisture in the air crystallized, forming delicate, intricate patterns of ice that hung suspended like floating snowflakes. The council members stared in stunned silence. Then, as quickly as it had come, Alara released the power. Her eyes returned to normal. The ice melted away, and the temperature normalized. This is Alara Thornwell, Kale announced. Frostweaver, Winter Queen, and your Luna. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one by one, the council members rose from their seats and dropped to one knee. Luna Queen, they said in unison. Alara felt tears prick her eyes. Acceptance, respect, honor. Everything Magnus had denied her, Kale's people gave freely. Rise, Kale commanded. We have a war to plan. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Kale summoned his warriors, and they came by the hundreds. Wolves from every corner of the Western Territories answered their king's call. By the third day, 800 warriors had assembled in the valley below Blackwood Citadel. It was the largest mobilization of force the territories had seen in a generation. Alara spent her time training with Moira, the elderly Frostweaver, who had been waiting at the Citadel gates. For decades, Moira had lived in hiding, believing herself to be the last of her kind. She had felt Alara's awakening on the mountain like a tremor through the earth itself and traveled for 2 days to offer her guidance. You've already unlocked the power, Moira said on their first day of training. Now I teach you to wield it without destroying yourself. They stood in a courtyard covered in fresh snow, and Moira began the lessons. The power is not just destruction, Moira explained. It is creation, protection, balance. She demonstrated creating a wall of ice that was crystal clear and harder than steel. Ice can be a shield, Moira said. It can protect those you love without harming your enemies. Though, she added with a wry smile, it can also be a very effective weapon when needed. Alara practiced for hours each day, learning to shape the ice to control the temperature around her, to create barriers and weapons with nothing but her will and the moisture in the air. But the most important lesson Moira taught her was about cost. Every use of power draws from your own life force, Moira warned. Your body temperature will drop. Use too much too quickly, and you risk freezing yourself from the inside out. You must learn your limits. Alara nodded, understanding. Power always came with a price. On the evening of the third day, Kale found her standing on the balcony of their chambers, looking out over the assembled army. Are you ready? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. I'm terrified, Alara admitted. What if I lose control? What if I hurt innocent people? You won't, Kale said with absolute certainty. Do you know how I know? Alara shook her head. Because you care, Kale said simply. Magnus doesn't care who he hurts to get what he wants. That's why he's a tyrant. You care about justice, about protecting the innocent. That's why you'll be a great queen. He turned her to face him, his golden eyes intense in the fading light. Tomorrow we march on Silver Pines. Not for conquest, not for revenge, for justice. For every wolf Magnus has exiled, for every life he's destroyed with his prejudice and cruelty, and most of all for you. Alara stood on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her fear and hope and love into that single gesture. For us, she whispered against his lips. The march south began at dawn. 800 wolves moved through the forest like a tide of fur and muscle. Kale led them in his massive black wolf form, and Alara rode on his back, wrapped in furs, against the cold she could now command but still felt. As they traveled, something extraordinary began to happen. Snow began to fall. Soft, gentle flakes at first, then heavier. But this was late December, and while snow was not unusual, the intensity and beauty of this snowfall was. It swirled around the army in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, never obscuring their vision, never impeding their progress, but creating an otherworldly atmosphere that struck awe into every heart. Alara was doing it unconsciously, her power responding to her emotions, creating a herald of winter's approach. By the time they reached the borders of Silver Pine's territory, on the third day, the entire forest was transformed. Ice crystals hung from every branch, catching the sunlight and throwing rainbows across the snow. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees below normal for the season. The scouts Magnus sent to investigate returned with terrified reports. The Voidborn has returned, and she commands winter. Magnus, safe in his hall, laughed it off as superstition, but there was a tremor in his voice. And when Rowan Blackthorn confirmed every word describing what he had witnessed on the mountain, Magnus's laughter died. Fear crept into the Alpha's heart. The army of Blackwood arrived at Silver Pines at dawn, surrounding the territory on all sides. It was an overwhelming display of force, 800 warriors against Magnus's 300. But Kyle had given strict orders: minimize casualties. The bull don't kill unless absolutely necessary. This was about justice, not genocide. Alara walked forward, alone, Kyle at her side in human form, both of them dressed for war. They stopped at the entrance to the great hall where Alara had been judged just 2 weeks ago. The mahogany doors opened, and Magnus emerged, flanked by Sienna and 50 warriors. Rowan stood behind him, his eyes downcast, unable to meet Alara's gaze. "You survived," Magnus said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "Impressive, but you're still just a Voidborn playing dress-up in borrowed power." "I survived because you underestimated me," Alara said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. "And now, Magnus, you're about to learn that the girl you left out in the cold is coming back to bring the storm directly to your doorstep." She raised her hand, and the falling snow began to swirl faster, forming a vortex around the Silver Pines warriors, not harming them, but making it clear that she held their lives in her palm. Magnus's face paled. "Attack!" he roared. The battle that followed was brief and brutal. Blackwood warriors crashed into Silver Pine's defenders with overwhelming force. Kyle had trained his wolves well. They disabled rather than killed, breaking legs and arms, forcing submissions, but avoiding lethal strikes. Alara moved through the chaos like a winter goddess. Ice barriers rose to protect Blackwood warriors from silver weapons. She froze the ground beneath charging enemies, sending them sprawling. She created walls that separated Magnus's forces, preventing them from coordinating. And then Sienna charged her. The silver-furred beta shifted mid-leap, aiming for Alara's throat with fangs bared. Alara didn't flinch. She raised her hand, and a spike of ice erupted from the ground, stopping inches from Sienna's heart. The beta crashed to the snow, scrambling back in terror. "You were my friend," Alara said, her voice breaking. "I loved you like a sister." Sienna shifted back to human form, her beautiful face twisted with rage and shame. "You were always weak," Sienna screamed. "Always the victim, always needing protection." "And you were always jealous," Alara replied sadly. "I would have shared everything with you. My successes, my joy, my life. But you chose status over loyalty. You chose cruelty over friendship." She could kill Sienna. One thought and the ice spike would pierce her heart. But Alara lowered her hand and the ice melted away. "Woo," Alara said. "Leave Silver Pines. Find redemption if you can, but you are no longer welcome here." Sienna stared at her in disbelief, then scrambled to her feet and fled into the forest. Meanwhile, Kale faced Magnus. The Alpha of Silver Pines shifted into a massive brown wolf, easily 9 feet long, his fur bristling with rage. He charged Kale with the fury of a cornered animal. Kale met him head-on, shifting into his midnight black form. The two Alphas collided with earth-shaking force. They were evenly matched in size, but Kale had something Magnus lacked: discipline, training, and the cold-focused rage of a king defending his mate. Kale's jaws found Magnus's shoulder, tearing deep. Magnus retaliated with claws tipped in silver, raking across Kale's flank. But before Magnus could press his advantage, the ground beneath his hind legs turned to solid ice. Elara had intervened. Magnus slipped his powerful legs, scrabbling for purchase. In that moment of vulnerability, Kale shifted back to human form and delivered a devastating punch to Magnus's snout. The brown wolf crashed to the snow, dazed. Kyle shifted back, standing over his defeated enemy. "Shift," he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of alpha authority. Magnus had no choice. His wolf submitted to the more dominant predator, and he shifted back into human form, bleeding and broken. "Kill me!" Magnus spat, blood on his lips. "Get it over with." "No," Alara said, stepping forward. "Not execution. The trial." She turned to face the assembled wolves of silver mines, many of whom had stopped fighting to watch this confrontation. "Gather in the great hall," Alara commanded, her voice amplified by the wind she now controlled. "All of you, every member of Silver Pines. You will bear witness to justice." Within the hour, the great hall was packed with over 250 wolves. The Blackwood warriors stood guard at the doors, but they did not interfere. This was Silver Pine's business. And Alara, as a daughter of this pack, had the right to call for judgment. Magnus was dragged before the tribunal table, forced to his knees. Rowan stood nearby, his face ashen. Alara stood where Magnus had stood 2 weeks ago, and Magnus knelt where she had knelt. "Magnus Ashford," Alara began, her voice steady and clear. "You stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of power, and crimes against your own pack. How do you answer, Yin?" "I did what was necessary," Magnus snarled. "The weak must be pruned." "Then let us examine your necessity," Alara said. She called Rowan forward. The beta offered immunity in exchange for truth, confessed everything. The conspiracy with Red Moon, the plan to use Alara as bait, the mercenaries, the silver weapons. Then Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his hands shaking. "I have a confession," the old doctor said, his voice breaking. "Alpha Magnus ordered me to falsify Alara's evaluation. He told me to declare her void-born, even though I detected faint elemental markers in her blood. Markers I didn't understand at the time." A gasp rippled through the hall. "He knew," someone whispered. "He knew she had power, and he exiled her anyway," another voice said. "Not anyway, doctor." Harrison said, tears streaming down his face. "Monsieur, because of it. He said she was a threat to his authority. He said if she awakened, she could challenge him. So he had me lie. He had me declare her defective. And then he sent her to die." The hall erupted in angry voices. "Order," Kale commanded, and silence fell. Alara called forward 12 Omegas, the lowest-ranking members of the pack. One by one they testified about Magnus's abuses, hoarding resources, exiling wolves who questioned him, threatening families to maintain control. By the time the testimonies ended, Magnus's support had crumbled. Even his most loyal followers looked at him with disgust. "The pack will vote," Alara declared. "All in favor of finding Magnus Ashford guilty of these crimes, make yourselves known." Every hand in the hall rose. Every single one. Even Rowan raised his hand. "Unanimous," Alara said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Magnus Ashford, you are found guilty." Magnus looked up at her with hatred burning in his eyes. "What will you do, little void-born? Kill me? That would make you just like me." "No," Alara said. "I will give you exactly what you gave me." She turned to the assembled pack. "Magnus Ashford, I strip you of your alpha title. I sever your pack bond, and I exile you from Silver Pines territory. You will walk into the wilderness alone with nothing but the clothes on your back. You will survive or die by your own strength. The same fate you gave to me and countless others." She looked down at Magnus, her eyes hard as ice. "But unlike you, I give you a chance. If you can survive, if you can change, you may petition for sanctuary in another pack, but you will never hold power again, and you will never return here." Magnus screamed, rage and denial tearing from his throat. "I am Alpha, I am—" "You are nothing," Kale said, his voice cutting through Magnus's protest like a blade. "Guards, remove him." 2 Blackwood warriors dragged Magnus from the hall. His screams echoed through the corridors as he was taken to the edge of the territory and cast out into the same wilderness where he had sent Alara to die. Silence fell over the great hall. Then slowly the wolves of Silver Pines turned to Alara, and one by one they bowed. "Luna Queen," they whispered. "Luna Queen." Alara stood in the place where she had been humiliated and broken, now surrounded by respect and acceptance. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of catharsis of justice finally served. Kale stepped to her side, taking her hand. "What would you have me do with this pack?" he asked her quietly. Alara looked out at the faces before her, her former packmates, wolves who had watched her suffer and done nothing, but also wolves who had suffered under Magnus themselves. "Merge them into the Western territories," Alara said. "Give them a chance to be part of something better. But first I want to build something here." She turned to address the pack. "This territory will become a sanctuary," Alara announced. "A place called Thornhaven, in honor of my parents who died defending these borders. It will be a refuge for any wolf who has been cast out, rejected, or deemed too weak by their packs. No wolf will ever be exiled for inability to shift. No Omega will ever be abused. No one will be left to die in the cold." The hall erupted in cheers, and in that moment Alara transformed from a broken, rejected outcast into a queen who would reshape the very foundations of pack society. 6 months later, in the warmth of early summer, Alara stood in a meadow filled with wildflowers. A memorial of white stone stood before her, carved with the names of her parents, Daniel and Iris Thornwell, defenders of silver pines, beloved parents. She placed a bouquet of mountain flowers at the base of the memorial, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. 3 months pregnant, the healer had confirmed that the child would be born with both lycanthropic and frostweaver traits, a hybrid of two ancient bloodlines representing a new era for the packs. Kale approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her and placing his hands over hers on her stomach. "They would be proud of you," he said softly. "I hope so," Alara whispered. "I hope I'm making the right choices." "You are," Kale assured her. "Thornhaven has already taken in 43 outcasts. Wolves who would have died are now thriving. You've changed the Western Territories, Alara. You've made us better." Alara leaned back against him, watching the sun set over the mountains. In the valley below, Thornhaven was growing. New buildings, new lives, new hope. She had received a letter from Sienna 3 weeks ago. The former Beta was working at an Omega sanctuary in Montana trying to atone for her past. She had asked for forgiveness, but Alara wasn't ready to give it yet. Maybe someday, but not today. Magnus, according to reports, had been spotted living as a rogue near the Canadian border. Alone, bitter, exactly as Alara had sentenced him. Justice, not revenge. "Do you ever regret it?" Kale asked. "Showing him mercy?" "No," Alara said. "Killing him would have been easy. But that would have made me like him. This way he lives with the consequences of his choices. And more importantly, I live with mine." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had saved her life by letting her save his. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing their conversation from months ago. "Only that it took so long to find my strength," Alara said. "But I wouldn't change anything. The pain forged me into who I needed to be." As the northern lights began to shimmer in the darkening sky, painting the heavens in shades of green and blue, Alara placed her hand over her heart. The silence that had haunted her for 21 years was gone. In its place was the steady hum of her frostweaver power, the electric pulse of the mate bond, and the new tiny flutter of life growing inside her. She was no longer broken, no longer rejected, no longer powerless. She was Alara Ravenshade, Luna Queen of the Western Territories, Frostweaver, mother of the New Age. The girl they called weak had saved a dying wolf in the snow, unaware he was the AlphaKing. The girl they cast out for being broken became the queen who rebuilt a kingdom. And as winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Alara Thornwell's story became legend. A story whispered around fires to inspire the outcasts and the forgotten. A story that proved weakness could become strength, and that even the coldest winter must eventually give way to spring. But for those who had wronged her, who had cast her out and left her to die, winter would always remember, and winter never forgives.